Jackson. Hey.
Hey, Dan. Grab your car and come with me. Just your card.
You gotta check inventory here.
Yeah. They got to check inventory because I'm pretty sure they got the exact same vehicle.
Yeah.
Probably wisely. Probably intentionally. Speaking of Craig, those little things like that make a difference. Like I remember, I have very few memories of the church my parents first attended when I was a kid. But I do remember one older man, I mean this is the 90s, so put this in context, who would give the kids a quarter every Sunday. And so I don't remember his name, I just remember him as Quarterman. Not quarterback, Quarterman. My mom and dad would remember his name. If I said, who was Quarterman, they would know exactly who I was talking about. Those little things like that make a difference.
We used to have a candy.
Yeah.
Had
Yeah.
a briefcase with candy in it.
We had a guy, and I don't know why he did it, but he would come up and as you're walking in, he'd shake your hand, give you a bulletin, give you a peppermint. He never gave one to me. I don't know why.
A bulletin or a peppermint?
Peppermint. The bulletin I wrote, so I think he assumed that I kind of knew what was going on that week when I put it together. But we're going to go ahead and get rolling there in Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16 will be our starting point. So last week we kind of looked at the Exodus, the children of Israel, after 400-something years in Egypt, they're finally free. They leave Egypt. They go through the Red Sea. And that moment, that image of Israel coming out of Egypt, going through the Red Sea, is a theme, is a motif that we really see throughout the Scripture. That image is repeated over and over and over and over again throughout the Bible. And so now Israel is a free country. They are a free people, and they are making their way to Sinai, which is where we will look at next week. But tonight they're in the middle of nowhere. They are in the wilderness. They are wandering around, and like we are so prone to do in our lives, they start to complain. They get hungry, they get thirsty, and they start to answer that age-old question that anyone with a kid has ever asked. Are we there yet? Or at least an ancient version of are we there yet? They ask, where's the food? Where's the water? And so how do the Israelites respond to hunger and thirst in the wilderness? There in Exodus 15, at the very end of the chapter, there's a story about being hungry. In Exodus 16, that's where it starts. We see it again later in Exodus 17. How do they respond to this hunger and thirst theme that we see that keeps popping up in our reading over the last week or so? What jumps out to you? Yeah.
They aim their unhappiness at their leaders,
Yeah.
not necessarily at God.
Yeah, and anyone who's ever served in a leadership capacity kind of understands, whether it's at work, whether it's at home, whether it's in the community, you kind of understand there's a cost to being a leader. That, if you're leading a department and something goes wrong, you're going to get the complaints from up top, and you're going to get the complaints from up the bottom. Your employees complaining that we didn't get a pay raise this year, or it's too rough, or the project's too difficult. They aim their complaints at their leaders. What else do you see there with their complaints regarding hunger and thirst in the wilderness?
I think it's interesting that they just go straight to that. Like, at least from what we get in the narrative, is they get hungry or they get thirsty and they just immediately go after Moses and Aaron.
Yeah.
And there's doesn't seem to be any sort of effort on their part to solve this in any other way.
Yeah.
You don't hear about them praying to God and asking for help first, or going to Moses for and Aaron first and asking for to be provided for. It just seems like they go straight from, oh wow, we're in the wilderness now and I'm hungry and thirsty.
Yeah.
Guess I'm just gonna yell at Moses.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Chris, what's going through your mind?
Well, two things. First of all, I mean, they're 45 days in and haven't eaten much.
Yeah.
So, you know, how many of us gone 45 days not eating much? I'm trying to have a lot more empathy for these guys. I think we kind of want to hop into their shoes. But I mean, they were living in Egypt. They were slaves, but they had food. They had a structure that was there. They were oppressed for sure. God's freedom is not free. But God's freeing them to a better place, to Him, and they need to depend on Him. So I get all that. But you know, now they're out in the middle of nowhere. They had homes there that they don't have anymore. So they're travelers just like Abraham was, only Abraham was rich and had a bunch of stuff around him. So now they're walking around, they're 45 days into this thing, and they're getting hungry.
Yeah.
And they've probably been hungry for some time before they started grumbling, I would assume. And I'm just trying to put myself in their shoes and saying, would I be any different? Would I really, I mean, gas goes up 5 cents a gallon, we're freaking out at the administration. I mean, you know, whatever administration, by the way, it's not a political statement. It doesn't matter what party is in office. When things become uncomfortable, we grumble.
That goes back to what Lisa said a moment ago.
Yeah.
They aim their complaints at the leaders. No matter who's in the White House, we complain about whatever's going on. Gas has gone up. Food's gone up. Whatever. Leaders get the complaints. Sydney and then Kevin.
I think it's interesting, like their first thought is to go back to how great it used to be, when it didn't actually used to be that great. Right? Like, it's over and over again, they're like, we were better off in Egypt. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I mean, you had some things, but wasn't that great?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like human nature, right?
Yeah.
Just to look back and think that things is better than
Yeah.
they really were.
Yeah, there's a line in a TV show. Don't you wish you knew you were in the good old days when it was the good old days? Those of you who know what TV show I'm talking about may be able to correct the exact phrasing of that quote. It's from the last episode of the TV show that may help you, involving a character named Andy. That may have given way too much, may not have given enough. But that's true. The Office, Sydney. It's-
Oh.
it-
Sorry,
you're looking at your mom going,
she wasn't gonna help me. if that
what
was
TV show is he
It
talking?
was the Andy Griffith Show. I thought
Yeah.
you were-
No, not Andy Griffith. She's like I'm familiar enough with the Andy Griffith Show because that's what I watched growing up. But there, yeah, Andy. I think it's the last episode of The Office. He goes, "Don't you wish you knew you were in the good old days when it was the good old days?" That's kind of the point I think Sydney's getting at is they're looking back at Egypt and go, "Man, we had it really good back then." No, you were slaves. You were being, maybe it's not the point that Sydney's making, maybe the exact opposite of the point that Sydney's making, but still, we have a tendency to look back at the old days and go, things weren't that bad back then. It's like, no, they were pretty bad. And in fact, them grumbling and complaining in chapter 16, I think it's chapter 16 and verse 3, that where they say, if we only had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Is that really how Egypt was? Was Egypt all cakes and lollipops and rainbows? Like, they're complaining there in verse 3 and even going back into chapter 15, really kind of revealed their total forgetfulness and lack of trust in God's redemption because they start praising the conditions of Egypt. And spoiler alert for those of us who, as we work our way through the Old Testament over the next couple of years, we're going to see them keep looking back to Egypt. And if you want to, look ahead to like Solomon's life, and what does he do? He looks to Egypt. Kevin, I've seen your hand up. What's going on?
I guess kind of my thoughts were kind of circling around like all of the comments
Yeah.
so far, and I think for me when I'm reading it, I'm already at a place where I'm recognizing like to Chris's point, like I'm recognizing my similarities to Israel at this time. And I think that that's kind of, just like when we read the Gospels, that we need to be reading it as like, I'm the Pharisees, I'm the Jewish leaders, or at least seeing in what ways I connect with them. So I guess when I'm reading it like that, then my takeaway is of like, what's my application here? Like, obviously, we can see what they're doing wrong.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty obvious as we read it, and that's why we're so rough on them.
Yeah.
But I think then to reflect back on, like Chris's point, was like, gas goes up, prices go up, and I'm upset. The cost of living goes up, and I'm upset. And my initial reaction is to grumble about it and complain. So whoever I place the blame on, and it's not necessarily directly placing the blame on God often, which Israel isn't exactly doing here either, and they're placing it on Moses, but it's still even though they're not placing it on God directly, it's indirect because they're missing the point of how God is taking care of them up until this point. They're thinking into the past about how good they thought it was. They're thinking into the future about how they're gonna starve in the short, near-term future.
Mhm.
They're not at all thinking about what could God do for them here.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned it, that I've mentioned it multiple times. These people that you see throughout the Bible having conversations with God, that's what the Israelites fail to do here. There's no
Yeah.
conversation with God. They don't have a relationship with God.
Mhm.
Moses and Aaron have a relationship with God. Later on in Exodus, the priests have a relationship with God, but the people
Yeah.
aren't engaging with God. They're not going to God as like, oh, I'm worried I'm gonna starve or die of thirst soon. I should talk to God about that. Like, there's just, that step in the process just doesn't exist for them. And I think for me, that's kind of the big call out is, boy, every time I sit here and grumble or complain about something, have I talked to God about it?
Yeah. Chris and then Sydney.
Well, I'm actually playing off of Sydney's thought about human nature. This is the first time they've grown. End of chapter 2. During the days of the king Egypt, during the many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. The cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered not them necessarily, but His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and He knew. And so, I think groaning is a human nature thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in this particular case, their plea wasn't made to leaders; their plea was made to God, and their plea was just, and He remembered the covenant with them. And now, as He's fulfilling the covenant, they're groaning, but they've forgotten what they actually asked for. What, a year ago?
Yeah. Sydney.
I think, like, to expand off of what I was saying before, like, legitimate change is hard, right? So, like, applying it to, like, what Kevin was saying, to, like, the application for real life, I think, is, like, if we take ourselves as, like, we were living a life in sin in Egypt, you're, like, following this there. We make legitimate change. It's difficult, and it becomes really easy to forget, like, what that life in sin was really like, and you kind of get, like, those rose-colored glasses of, like, it used to be comfortable and it used to be easy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where, like, legitimate change is hard,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you forget
Yeah.
how things really were when you're in the midst of it.
Yeah. That's the application that keeps coming to my mind, really, just in terms of us. Looking back on that old life of sin, as Sydney was saying, a lot of times, or sometimes maybe we'd be tempted to kind of romanticize it. Like, back before I became a Christian, I used to be able to do X, Y, Z, and now I can't do that anymore. My life is no fun or whatever. And we forget about, if I can use this illustration, the hangover. Like the misery of waking up and going, oh, my head is pounding or whatever. We have a way of romanticizing the past. and forgetting, and thereby, or therefore, forgetting everything that God has done for us. And what really strikes me, at least in this complaining, at least what we see in these initial complaints in Numbers 15, or not Numbers, Exodus 15, 16, and 17, is that they're days, as Chris has brought up, days out of Egypt. Like, they remember seeing the 10 plagues. They remember seeing the water divide. They remember what God has done to redeem them. They remember the cries of the Egyptians when they woke up to the firstborn dead. God did so many things to save them, to redeem them. And so, like, in our minds, 3,500 years later, we're like, if God was going to go to all that effort to redeem you, don't you think he would provide for and make sure you're not going to die in the middle of a desert? But then, as so many of you guys have hinted at, or mentioned, we do the exact same thing in our life. That God has saved us, God has provided for us, God has done so many awesome, wonderful things for us, and yet we have the tendency to do the exact same thing. To look and go, my life is so awful, whatever. Is God ever going to do anything for me? And it's like, what about yesterday? And so there is this theme, there is this temptation for us to complain about everything, and I get it because I do it too. But I think this is one of the lessons we can learn from Israel.
He seems to want us to ask, to realize we need something, and then he gives a gift. He doesn't just give it to us, and we just take it for granted. He wants us to realize that, hey, we need help, and could you help us? And he always does.
And that connects to the New Testament in many ways, because what God is doing for Israel in the wilderness, and that's providing bread and water, is what we see Jesus doing in the New Testament, that he's feeding the crowds. And the point of Jesus feeding the crowds there, the multitudes, is not so that people go, well, this is awesome. He's our Safeway. He's our QFC. He's our, I guess Amazon Fresh is no more. He's our Whole Foods. It's so they see God's power in Jesus and they believe. So they learn to live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. In fact, when Jesus is tempted in Matthew's gospel, which is designed written in such a way to kind of point out and emphasize that Jesus is the new Moses, the first way Jesus responds to Satan's temptation is to say, man shall not live by bread alone. It's to learn to trust in God. And so these things, and this is kind of one of those themes, one of these words we see multiple times in tonight's text, is that these things are happening to test Israel, so Israel will build up the faith they need to have to learn to trust in God. What else do you guys see here? This is like so much of our lesson tonight. You see there, they come and they're thirsty there at the end of verse 15, so they cry out, grumble to Moses. Moses cries out. And the whole situation here in end of chapter 15, praise to complaint. You see that pop up. And then they go into chapter 16, and they're in the middle of the desert. And they start complaining, and they look back at Egypt. God says in verse 4, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. John chapter 6, Jesus looks back on this text and God says, I was that bread. I was a fulfillment of that. And he talks to him about all of that bread and God providing for them. And so Aaron speaks in verse 12. God says, I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will eat bread until you are full. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Your Bible's going to have that in all caps. That's Yahweh. That's the covenant name for God. The Lord your God. Then you will know. Have we seen that phraseology in the book of Exodus before? What was the point of the plagues? So that Israel or Pharaoh would know that the Lord is God. He worked those plagues to judge Egypt. Now he's raining down blessings on his covenant people so that they will know that he is the Lord their God. And this covenant blessing that you see here in Exodus chapter 16 comes with an instruction manual that they needed to obey. That they needed to gather as much as each person needs to eat. You may take 2 quarts per individual according to the number of people each of you has in your tents. Some of the Israelites did this. Some gathered a little. Some gathered a lot. They measured. There was the person who gathered a lot had no surplus, and the person who gathered a little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as he needed to eat. And Moses said to them, "No one is to let any of it remain until morning." Verse 20. But they didn't listen to Moses. And it tells us why. Some people left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. Why did they gather more than they needed? Why did they stick it in their ancient Tupperware containers and stick it in the fridge? Or their Yetis?
I mean, God says in verse 4 that I'm going to test them.
Yeah.
And that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. And so he's giving him this gracious abundance. He's asking them to do it, to do for some parameters around this. It doesn't make it any less free food.
Yeah.
But he really is looking. Is their heart with him?
Yeah.
And I know it says law, and a lot of times we get stumbled over law. But the point in this case, I think, is the law points to do they want to walk with me? Do you want to walk the equivalent of walking with Jesus today? Do you want to walk with God, or are you gonna rely on yourself?
Yeah.
And by verse 20, it's very evident that the vast majority are still trying to rely on themselves, even though God is the one giving them everything.
And this is a struggle they're having at the very beginning of their faith journey. Are they going to trust Jesus, God? Are they going to listen to what he has to say? Are they going to obey? And God's patient. He gives them all these tests to build up their faith. That's the design. So he's really, really, really patient with them as he tries to build up their faith at the very beginning of the wilderness journey. But if we were to skip ahead to Numbers 10 and 11, which is why I keep saying Numbers tonight, they make some of the same complaints, and it's near the end of their wilderness journey. It's farther down the road. And they're still having the same problems and the same complaints. And it's like God is saying, guys, we've been down this road. By this point in time, you should trust me. By this point in time, you should know that I am going to provide. Like 1 or 2 days, I get it. You're going to stick the manna in the Tupperware container and stick it in your Yeti cooler because you're not sure if I'm going to bring food tomorrow morning. But you've learned over a couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months, I'm going to do what I say every morning. I'm going to be faithful to my promises. And that's a struggle they have for their entire wilderness wanderings, even to the point when they get to the promised land later down the road and they get in, they send the spies, and the spies come back and go, yeah, God was right. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. It is an awesome place to live. Oh, by the way, there's giants there and we can't take it. Like, they completely forgot that God had been faithful to every promise that he had made. And if he was going to be faithful to every promise that he was made, he was going to be faithful to the promise to give them the land. That was one of their struggles that they had their entire history, and yet it's also one of the struggles that we have. Right. Yeah, Kevin.
I think that's why I was hitting so hard on talking to God, and I think Tammy's comment really hit with me, resonated, because that was kind of what I was trying to get at. Is I think that we see here, and for me, I've experienced it. It only goes so far to remember the things that God already did. Mm-hmm. There's a huge hurdle to go think of well, I can think back throughout my life and all these times that I know that it was God's hand that made it happen. But does that really help me that much at the next trial? It helps me some,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean I just like coast through the next trial and don't worry about it at all. And so I think remembering what God did, knowing that it was him, is part of the picture. And God tells him that that's what it is. Like when he does the Sabbath, like this is why you're doing the Sabbath, because you're remembering how I got you out of Egypt and you were working, now you're resting. But the other aspect that the Israelites keep failing on over and over and over again, every time they're confronted with a trial, they're not remembering, but they're not talking to God about it. And that was I think that's what, they just fail to talk to God every single time. Like when the spies go into Canaan, they don't see the giants and think like they could have gone to God and said like, wow, God, like, this is cool, but I'm really scared about this. I think God's reaction would have been very different than
Yeah.
them just talking amongst themselves and deciding like they can't do it.
Yeah.
That's what I think we do a lot though. We might remember all the blessings that he's given us in the past, but the next time the trial comes, we're suddenly fearful and doubtful again. And like that should be like the warning signs to us of like, you know what, I can be fearful and doubtful, but instead of just sitting here and fretting about it and complaining and grumbling about it, this is when I need to go tell God about it. And that's what I see the Israelites failing over and over again.
I like the illustration, the point you make there. What if, just for a second, this is not how the story goes, but imagine for a second they got to the borders of Canaan. The spies go into Canaan, they come back and say, it is flowing with milk and honey, but there's giants. And rather than going, we can't do it, they go, God, you were right. It is a land flowing milk and honey. Thank you for giving us this land, but there's some giants and we don't know what to do. What would you like us to do, God? You have provided for us up to this point. What would you like us to do? I think that's a completely different response. But instead, as Kevin's pointed out, they give up. And then we think about some of the applications that maybe Kevin pointed out there, and as he was going, I was thinking about maybe in a time in our lives where we've been jobless per se, and we've prayed for a job and we get the job and life happens and maybe we get laid off or we get downsized or something happens and we have to move to a new city and we're looking for a job and we're like, well, God's not going to provide me for a job. Did he? Remember the last time? What about this time? Can you do it this time too? And there's that constant struggle that we have in terms of those conversations that we need to have with God, to kind of borrow the phrase that we keep bringing up in our classes over the last quarter and a half or so, about being willing to go to God and go, God, I don't know what you want here. This is hard. I got some questions, but I'm going to put it in your hands because I know that you're a good God and that you will provide for his people. Yeah, Lisa, I see your hands. What's going on?
I have a midweek Wednesday morning class, and we were talking about prayer this morning, and one of the ladies shared that in her prayer, she has an opening prayer and a closing prayer every day, and so the morning prayer is focused on the day to come, and the evening prayer is focused on the day she just had, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it focuses her mind to, what do I want God's help on today, and then what has God done for me today, and where could I have served him better or trusted him
Yeah.
better. And I love that, like
Yeah.
the idea of every day being like, where was my trust in God today, you
Yeah.
know? And to me, it would make confession so much more active if I'm only praying for the little things in the day and not trying to remember some big sin that was in the past
Yeah.
week, you know?
Yeah.
I just love that opening and closing idea
Yeah.
that every day would have that daily dependence on God.
Yeah, I think it's Psalm 3 and 4. That one of them's a morning prayer and one of them's an evening prayer, and they're back to back in Psalms. And in fact, one of the things is trailer for some things we'll look at later, whether it's this year or next year. We're going to look at the Psalms, and I think the Psalms actually have a structure, and they're grouped together for a reason. And I find it very interesting that Psalm 3 and 4, an evening and a morning prayer, are back to back. And I wonder if that may be the reason that the writer is meditating on some things, so maybe requests for God during the morning, and then thanking God in the afternoon, in the evening before he goes to bed. a fun, deeper study. Chris, did I see your hand pop
Yeah,
up?
it just, so I absolutely, yeah, I think they're stumbling on the relationship with God. Our context to that is a combination of prayer and study, because they're two sides of the same coin. And if we're reticent to pray, I think we've got challenges, but I think we're also, if we're reticent to study and to keep learning and to keep seeing God's plan and His, then it becomes one-sided, and the narrative ultimately becomes just our prayers for what we want, or what we think we want, or what we think's best. Whereas if the combination, if they're working in concert, then we're continuing to deepen that relationship with God.
Yeah. And we've been dancing around this question already, just to kind of move us a little forward. Because the next question has to do with the testing at Massah in Meribah, which is another time a little bit later down the road where they start complaining and they want water, and they start going, why did you bring us up from Egypt? Does this sound familiar? Chapter 17 and verse 3, to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst. Look, I like water. I think most of us want to drink water. And we know how it feels, maybe after a long hike or long day at work, if we work a physical job, or maybe we haven't drunk enough that day and we just can't put enough water down. We know how it feels to be thirsty. And Moses is frustrated. He cries out to the Lord, what do I do with these people? They're going to stone me. And God provides there in verse 5. God provides in verse 6. And in verse 7, they test the Lord and they say, is the Lord among us or not? Keep in mind, again, some of the things that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, where, God has seen their afflictions. Chris quoted in Exodus 2, and He knew. And when they exited Egypt, they had the cloud and they had the fire, representing God's presence with them. Here, God is providing for them, and they're still wondering, is God among us? Is God with us or not? And that idea, that concept of the presence of God is going to dominate the next several chapters, and even into Leviticus and even into Numbers, because they're going to go to Sinai, and they're going to spend a lot of time at Sinai, where God comes down and dwells with His people there at Sinai. And really the next, from Exodus 19 through 40, is setting up the stage for God to dwell with His people. In fact, at the end of the book, the last verses in the book of Exodus, spoiler alert, by the way, are God coming down in a presence so thick Moses can't enter the tabernacle. And so their question is answered at the end of the book. Is God really with us? And the answer is yes. He's with you so much that Moses can't enter. Aaron can't enter. And then you see the book of Leviticus, and I don't want to go down that path. We'll talk about that later in due time. But as they wonder and they wrestle with that question, is God really with us? What happens in verse 8? The Amalekites attack. Who are the Amalekites?
Austin, can we go back for a second before we get to the Amalekites? Another angle on this couple chapters that I think is fascinating, and you've already mentioned in the previous Exodus classes that you want us to be thinking ahead, like how does this tie into the Gospels, and I'm just reading and seeing this like chock full of things that happen in the New Testament or alluded to in the New Testament. And I think there's a side of this is like Exodus is so dramatic. Like there's the plagues, and we get out of they cross the Red Sea. That's dramatic, and then now they're in the wilderness, and they need water, and they're at a spring that has water, but it's indigestible. So how do they fix it? Like they cut a tree down and throw it in there, and then they need water again, and those strikes the water. There's so much. This is like big gestures, and to me, when I see stuff like that, I think like that means there's symbolism there that like we should be picking up on. And I think you already alluded to, like, Jesus calls back to, you remember the manna that came down from heaven? I am the bread of heaven. Same thing, like, you remember that rock, the water from the rock that gave me life? I am the water of life. He's also the rock that was struck and smitten for the people. Like, it's just like there's so much detail that's packed in here. Even the Israelites collecting manna on the Sabbath day. I really think that this, when you're in the New Testament and Jesus and his disciples are plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees call them out. Like, I think that that's where that's coming from. Like, if God is mad at the Israelites because they went out and tried to pick up bread off the ground on the Sabbath, then Jesus and the disciples pulling heads of grain off stalks of plants on the Sabbath seems like that would also be equivalent. So like there's parallels here in us understanding where the Pharisees' heads are at and stuff like that are occurring. And I just think like there's in like a couple chapters, it's just like back to back to back. There's things that connect us. That it's loaded with. There's meaning for us to extract here and lessons to learn from. Am I like the Israelites? How do I not be like them? What do I do instead? But then there's also lessons of what is God like. There's also lessons of there's a layer here for me to learn from, but then there's also symbolism that is in the New Testament and tied to Jesus that's there for me to learn from. And it's just so loaded with detail.
And I'm glad you're catching those things. And I may have said this in previous classes. I'll say it again. One of my mentors, one of the guys I really respect, describes Genesis 1 through 11 as the operating system of the Bible. Basically, it's what makes Bible run. It has all this stuff that you got to understand. I think Exodus may be the user interface, where we see so many of these themes really come to life. Like, it's hard to read the book of Exodus without seeing some of the themes, some of the concepts, some of the motifs that Kevin's just mentioned, because we're reading this because we know the full story. We can go to our Bibles, Genesis to Revelation, and we're like, wait a second here. We know about drinking from the rock. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 10. We know these stories. We know these applications in terms of Jesus being the bread from heaven and feeding the crowds and Jesus providing food and water. Like, we know all this stuff. We see the full picture. Exodus is just chock full, whatever, overloaded with all these images that help us, that we see in the New Testament. It is almost like the interface to understanding the biblical story. Even that question, is the Lord among us? One of the key driving themes of the entire biblical story is the presence of God. Is God's relational presence. But his desire to walk and to be with his people. You see it in Genesis with the patriarch. You see it here in Exodus. You see it in the Gospels. John chapter 1 is quite explicit. That Jesus came down and he tabernacled. He dwelt with his people. That's that image popping back up again. Jesus' name, I think in Matthew 1, is Emmanuel, God with us. These images, these ideas, these concepts keep coming back up. So keep an eye out for these things as we're reading. So who are those Amalekites? Who are they? Why are they so important?
Descendants of Esau.
Descendants of Esau, which means they're like distant cousins. Really distant cousins by this point in time, but they're part of the overall Abrahamic line, for lack of a better way of phrasing it. And yet they come up and they attack Israel. Other passages describe how Amalek came up and they were attacking the stragglers, the old and the weak, and the ones that were falling behind, and they come up and attack, so Israel fights back. And so when Moses holds up his hand, this is one of those stories I think we teach our kids in Bible classes. holds up his hand, Israel wins. When his hand get a little heavy, Amalek prevailed. And apparently he did it long enough, had enough help that they eventually won the battle and Israel won. And there in verse 14, the Lord said, I just gave away this question. Oops. I wonder why Lisa and Sydney were back there smiling. It's like, well, you just answered the question. The Lord said there in verse 14, write this down on a scroll as a reminder and recite it to Joshua. I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. So where do we see Amalek again in the biblical story? So they fight against Israel here, and later down the road, some 400 years later, God speaks to somebody whose name begins with S and ends with all. Who does God speak to? Saul. And 1 Samuel 15 and says, hey, I want you to go destroy Amalek. And what's he do? He doesn't do it. What's he do instead? Keeps the spoil and keeps the king. And what's the king's name? Anybody remember? Agag. Keeps Agag alive. He didn't obey God. And some 500 years after Saul was alive, in the book of Esther, we read about this guy named Haman. And what is Haman called? The Agagite. And what does Haman want to do in the book of Esther? Destroy all the Jews. Why do you think he wants to destroy all the Jews? Because he knows what the Jews have done to his people 500 years earlier. How they were almost wiped out 500 years earlier. On top of that, he's a little peeved at Mordecai, who is called the son of Kish. Who was the son of Kish? Saul. That theme, this struggle between Israel and Amalek, moves the story forward. And by the way, there are a truckload of parallels in the Esther story between Esther and the story of Jesus. But Amalek becomes a thorn in Israel's side, all because of this passage. Because Amalek went after the weak. So God makes a promise there in verse 14. I'm going to completely blot them out. Israel's successful. They're victorious here in verse 15. And Moses built an altar and said, the Lord is my banner, which is interesting because in the ancient world, the armies were named for their gods. And so by putting the Lord is my banner, this altar, he is saying the Lord, that's our God. That's his way of saying the Lord is the reason we're victorious. The Lord is our God. Indeed, he said, verse 16, my hand is lifted up toward the Lord's throne, and the Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. That struggle continues throughout the biblical story. Any thoughts on chapter 17? And then Jethro jumped onto the scene there in chapter 18. And what does Jethro recognize about God? Again, who is Jethro? What nationality is Jethro? Let's start there. He is, in chapter 18, verse 1, Midian. So he's also part of the broader family of God, another distant cousin, once removed on his father's side. And yet he is described as a priest. Okay, let's just pause here before we answer this question. Can you think of another person in the biblical story up until this point that encounters the people of God after a major military event in Gentile territory who is described as a priest? Melchizedek. The first two people called priests, specifically called priests in the biblical story, to the best I can tell, are Gentiles. They're outside the broader covenant family of God. That's interesting. And so Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, heard about everything that God had done for Moses. News travels fast, even in the ancient world. They pulled up their ancient CNN on their tablets and found out that, the Egyptian army was destroyed there in the Red Sea. That kind of news travels fast in the ancient world. And Jethro comes to Moses. And what does Jethro start to realize here in chapter 18 about God?
Says he's greater than all the
Yeah, all the other gods, yeah. Like in the ancient world, they didn't think anything about adding another god to the pantheon. Like, what's another god? No big deal. So there's a lot of discussion, just for this, there's a lot of discussion. Is Jethro a priest of God and God alone? Or is he a priest of the gods in general and just recognizing that this God is greater than the other gods? There's a lot of discussion, a lot of different opinions, and a lot of different takes on that. I want to let you guys know that. Whatever the case is, he looks at the Red Sea. He looks at the Exodus. He looks at everything that's happened over the last year or so and goes, okay, there's something to this God. There's something powerful. No other God that I've encountered has the power to do the things that your God does. What else do you guys see there about Jethro and his, what he recognizes about God?
Well, this is an interesting section because from what we see anyway, Moses doesn't go to God and say, hey, how should I manage things? But Jethro looks and says, you're going to kill yourself here. All the people are coming to you, you need to set it up differently. And the fact is, they set it up, they did it. Now, you can make an assumption that they were communing with God the entire time as they were doing this, there were sacrifices given there. There's things that are taking place, but at the same time, there are things that I think God endorses us to be His people and to act rightly in the things that we need to do. He doesn't control every single aspect of life in that way.
Yeah.
You can depend on Him for every single aspect of life, but you're not a puppet. He's not controlling that, and nor is he running the government here. What he's running is the law. What he's running is the covenant. And there's a difference.
Yeah, to kind of build on what he said about Jethro's advice, which Chris just kind of answered this question. Moses is going to run himself into a ground. Like, he's trying to handle, there are 600,000 men, it says, and so let's say every man has a wife and 2 kids and a picket fence. That's 6 times 4, 2.4 million people. Assuming that every able man had a wife and 2 kids. May not be the case. You're looking at a lot of people, and every complaint, every problem, they're going to Moses. And so parents who thought it was bad with 3 kids or 2 kids or 1 kid or whatever it is complaining about problems, just imagine 2 million people coming to you with all your complaints. As Chris said, he's going to run himself in the ground. That's what Jethro, you're going to run yourself ragged. Here's some wise advice. As an older man, here's some wise advice. You need to do this. Instead of, under managers or whatever. Delegate. That's a good word. Delegate responsibility. And yet I think about what he's doing here in that advice. And what do we see in the church there in Acts chapter 6? What does the church there in Acts chapter 6 do? They've got this problem between the Hellenistic Jews and the native-speaking Jews. And the response of the leaders there in the Church of Jerusalem is like, you know what, we're going to micromanage, we're going to do everything. What do? They delegate. Pick 6 men. And as Chris has just said, and I'm glad he said it, God has given us the law, His design, what He wants, whether for Israel here in Exodus, but for us as part of the church. And there are times and places where we have a little, I don't say flexibility, but that's the best way to figure out the best way to accomplish those commands of God, what God really wants. And in this passage, Jethro says, Moses, delegate. In Acts chapter 6, it's church, delegate. Leaders, delegate. What else do you guys see here in chapter 18 as we think about Jethro and his advice for Moses? Incidentally, any chapter on the last, any kind of sermon on the last half of 18, it's almost always on delegation and leadership. It's hilarious. You open up a commentary and it's like, we're going to talk about delegation and leadership here. It's hilarious. What else do you guys see here? One of the things I see there in verse 12, this goes back to the previous question, is that Jethro brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And he acts as a priest, and he leads the people, or leads some people in worship to God. This is before the covenant is enacted. Because those commands don't come down until Sinai, which we're going to look at next week. So he leads people in worship there. What else do you guys see there in chapter 18? Any final thoughts, comments, questions?
Well, I think that's a key point. Is this is pre-Mosaic covenant, and I think that he has relationships, good or bad, with the entirety of mankind at this point. But he has a covenant promise that he's made to this particular people that he's going to see through the Mosaic covenant. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have interactions, and that's where I think you get Jethro and you get Melchizedek and you get all of these others. We're following one thread of a storyline here that leads to Jesus, but sometimes we isolate that and think, well, God's not. But God makes it very clear early on in Genesis that He's the God of all people.
Yeah, and even kind of building on that comment, Chris, you have Melchizedek leading Abraham in worship, Jethro leading Aaron in worship as priests. But what's going to happen in Exodus 19 is he's going to make Israel as a priest, a kingdom of priests, to, if I can use this terminology, to lead the nations in worship to God, to point the nations to God. And that is going to become a driving force in really what they're supposed to be doing. That their purpose as God's people is so that Babylon and Assyria and Syria and the Hittites and the Arameans and all the countries around them look at Israel and go, there is no country like Israel. There is no God like Israel's God. That their conduct and their character is so otherworldly. We want that God. We want to know that God. That their God has showered down blessings on them. We want to be a part of that people too. That was their point. That was their purpose. And we look ahead at the rest of the Old Testament, and they just utterly failed at that. To be the kingdom of priests. To draw the nations to God. They dropped the ball. And God in His grace and God in His mercy still worked through them. He was still faithful to His promise. He still brought Jesus to the world. And yet Jesus has now made us, as God's people, a kingdom of priests, to draw the nations to Him. Does our conduct and our character reflect that? Are we living as the priests that God would have us to be as His people? God has always had a plan for the nations in Genesis all the way to the end of the story. I go back at least to Genesis chapter 12, highlighting this story, to kind of, again, tying in with Chris's comment. And built into the promise to Abraham is a promise to all nations. At the end of Revelation, there's a promise for all nations. That God has always wanted to know and have a relationship with all people. And it is imperative for his people to act in such a way, to live in such a way that the nations come to him through them. Any final thoughts, comments, or questions? Okay. We'll call it quits there, and we'll pick up in Sinai next week on a Sunday. We are going to kick off a new series called Relatable. 6 or 7 classes looking at Jesus' conversations with people in the Gospel of Luke or the book of Acts, which would be the disciples, and what they teach us about evangelism. So these little conversations, the encounters that Jesus has along the way, what can we learn about teaching the gospel to others? So that's where we're going on Sunday, and on Wednesday we'll continue our study of Exodus at Sinai. On that note, class.